Hi, welcome to my video talking about AO2 scenario questions in the OCR law exam. This is a really good opportunity to get some very high marks, especially considering that scenario questions make up 50% of each of the 3 papers that you'll be doing. So you'll have to answer some scenarios on tort law, criminal law, and on contract law. So what is it that you have to do in these scenarios? You need to think of it essentially as 2 questions in one. You have 30 minutes to achieve 25 marks. 10 of those marks are for your AO1, which is showing your knowledge and understanding of the particular topic. And then 15 marks are for your AO2, and this is your application of your knowledge and understanding to the given facts in the scenario. So essentially, you have to act as a lawyer and advise the client. So what I want to do in this video is just to talk you through each of those assessment objectives individually and kind of give some of my top tips on how to revise and how to answer the questions. So with AO1, remember, this is your knowledge. Now, I've kind of put to the side here, this is essentially a template. You can write a perfect AO1 frames, and I've talked about this in previous videos when it comes to answering Section A questions, but you can essentially write a skeleton answer that covers all the different topics. So for example, you can easily write down the top 10 points that would need to be talked about in a Relevance scenario, or in a misrepresentation scenario, or a scenario about theft. However, to get the highest marks, to get that level 4 excellent, it needs to be tailored specifically to the scenario. You probably won't have time to write every single thing that you know about in every single answer. For example, occupier's liability is quite a big topic, and if you start talking about the common law, the 57 Act, the rules for children, the rules for tradesmen, the defences, the 84 Act, that's a lot to cover in essentially 10 minutes. So you must keep it relevant. Imagine a lawyer, if you went to a lawyer and said to them, oh, well, you know, I fell over in a park and injured myself because something was broken. If your lawyer started turning around and saying, well, let me tell you about the rules relating to 3-year-olds, you wouldn't be happy and you wouldn't want to pay for that advice. So have the same mindset in the exam. All of the AO1 that you were talking about must relate to the scenario. However, it's really important that at this point, at the start of your essay, you do not refer to the people in the scenario. The reason for this is that it'll automatically become AO2 and you won't get any of those 10 marks available. So think of this as vanilla law advice at the moment. You are simply setting out what the law is. You are not relating it to anybody in the scenario yet. That being said, you are relaying that advice with those people in mind. You need to be giving relevant acts or case examples. So again, the better answers will have cases that have something linked to the scenario. So often the scenarios are written to be similar to case examples. Can you spot those? So for example, we recently had an occupier's liability scenario where a girl ignored signs and went into a lake, which is very similar to Tomlinson. To get the higher marks, you need to recognise that and give those. And that's why we teach so many cases, so you can instantly make those links, and they're usually pretty straightforward, quite obvious links to similar cases. There isn't a right or wrong number of case examples, I'm afraid, to be able to tell you. There is no kind of maximum to put in. I would say try as a minimum to get at least 3, but remember you're competing with other students. So if it's a very heavy case law area, so for example something like diminished responsibility or negligence, in order to get the highest marks you need to be getting more cases in than everybody else. So just time yourself 10 minutes and see how much you can typically write in that time. How much law and how many case examples can you put in 10 minutes? A lot of people tell me they get stuck on the starting sentence. Very simply, such and such is. That is the best way to get started. It's no frills and it avoids waffle. So for example, you might talk about burglary is, or nuisance is, or frustration and contract law is. The best way to start, and it gets the ball rolling. For most topics, you should lay out your answer to do that AO1 without referring to any names, and then the AO2 after. And in fact, feel free to put headings in to clearly show the examiner that this is where my 10 marks are going to be and this is where my 15 marks are going to be. However, I do think there are a few topics that jump to mind that benefit from a more blended approach. And I've got a list here and you can see how I put them down here. So for example, for negligence, I would talk about duty and then decide if there is a duty of care. Then I would go back to my AO1 explaining breach, and then I would apply it. And you can see how I've laid these out on the bottom here. Now again, feel free to use headings. So for example, you might put AO1 diminished responsibility, then write it, and then AO2 diminished responsibility. Then you might put AO1 loss of control, and then AO2 loss of control. So you can still use headings, and you can even do a heading for conclusion if you like, but I think these sometimes benefit from a more blended approach because I think it's easier than going back to the start. But if in doubt, stick to this structure. Even for these topics, this is your level 1. So talk about the AO1, sometimes helps with headings, and then talk about the AO2. So what should we be doing in an AO2 question? This is where the bulk of your marks are, remember. So this is your 15 marks. The first most important thing is to check the command line carefully. What actually is the question asking you to do? So for example, if it's a manslaughter question, do you need to talk about just murder? Or do you need to talk about murder and loss of control? Or do you need to talk about loss of control and diminished responsibility? Read very, very carefully what you've got to decide. It might also give you some information about which particular people you need to decide are responsible for what. So who might be considered for robbery and who might be considered for burglary, for example. If you check that, you get it the right way around. So for example, in contract law, when it comes to performance and getting compensation for breach, are we coming at it from the person who is saying, I haven't finished the job, but I deserve some money? Or is the question coming from the angle of, should the other person have to pay considering the job is incomplete? So you've really got to check the command line and see what angle you need to consider the question from. Check every sentence of the scenario. Every sentence is written and edited in there for a reason. It gives you some information that you should comment on, and examiners really like if you can take direct quotes. That being said, avoid retelling the story. If you've ever had that friend that's told you about something that happened when you were there, you don't need to rehear that. So imagine the examiner or the client, they were there. They don't need to be told what happened to them. So instead, what you just need to do is give them evidence. So avoid saying something like, Anna walked down the street and then she fell down a manhole. That's in the scenario. Instead, take bits of information from the scenario and use it to support your answers. So for example, I think that what happened was a qualifying trigger because the things that she said in terms of XYZ were quite serious. So use the information, but don't just retell it. You will find that some areas of the scenario are quite straightforward and therefore don't require a lot of argument. So for example, in an occupier's liability question, you might find that who is the occupier is straightforward and whether it is premises is easy. However, there will be parts of the question that are vague and don't seem to have an easy, straightforward answer. We have to have this in the exam because how else is the examiner going to tell the difference between your A-star candidates and your D candidates? If everybody gets the right answer, there is nothing to tell you apart. So there will be things in there that leave you scratching your head. Don't be deterred by this. Instead, always lay down both sides of the argument. See it from both points of view. So on the one hand, this could be a gross breach in gross negligence manslaughter because on the other hand, it may not be seen as gross and therefore so bad it's criminal because once you've said both sides of the argument, you're going to get both types of credit there. You still need to pick a side, but essentially you've done the hard work and it is less important which side you pick because you've already shown the examiner that you understand the query. You must come to a conclusion. That's part of picking a side. However, don't feel like your conclusion has to be at the end. For example, you might talk about diminished responsibility and then whether the defendant could rely on that. That's a conclusion. Then you might go through loss of control and decide whether the defendant could use that defence. That would be another part of the conclusion. You don't then have to write an overall conclusion because chances are you're just repeating what you've already said. However, if it is something that you would maybe come to neatly tie up at the bottom, so for example, has consideration been provided as part of a contract, you may want to state very strongly at the end which conclusion you make. You must have that for at least level 2, 3 and 4. You must have a valid conclusion. Don't forget that link to similar cases. Remember, cases are really part of your AO1 marks. But again, if there is something very, very similar that happens in a scenario and you want to be able to talk about it, you want to link it back, then please do. So for example, if the victim dies because they refused a blood transfusion, you may explain what will happen. And then you might say, this was similar to the case of R versus Blau. It's just saying very clear to the examiner, I've noticed the link and I've noticed this scenario is very much like that case. So how do we do this? Well, with your AO1, I would just advise writing lists of key points, and I've talked about this in my Section A video. For AO2, I don't really think there's any way around it but practicing. By practicing, you're going to spot the different things that come up in a scenario, and you're going to become more comfortable with how long it takes to write and your writing style and structure. Where do you find past examples? Well, there are past papers, and on the Microsoft Teams section of the Newcastle Sixth Form College website, I've got the link to the OCR website. You can also use old specification questions, which we commonly use in class. They are 50-mark questions, so that's 50, but they work in a similar way, and you would still go through and answer in exactly the same manner. Try university questions. So you can often find these online, or if you've got any friends at university, see if you can get university questions. I'm a big believer that if you can do university level questions, you can handle A level no problem. And finally, of course, ask your teachers. They'll be more than happy to supply some mini scenarios for you to do, or make some up. Try making some up yourself as well. Thank you for watching.